The Standard of Ur is a fairly small piece, but much like the Stele of the Vultures, which we just looked at, it is again commemorating a single story, a single narrative, even if we don't know exactly what it is. Now, when we look at it, and here we're looking at both sides of it, so we have front side and back side being shown one above the other. What we're seeing is one narrative, warfare first, and then a banquet as a victorious celebration, or possibly a cult ritual. At the top, we see representations of war, the soldiers moving across, the charioteers. At the bottom, we have that idea of the banquet. And we get a lot of sense of movement here. So, for example, we get the idea of the army moving across the registers. And here we're seeing that use of registers just like we saw on the Wark of Vaz. And so we have figures coming up, probably a liberating army coming out, people pleading in the upper right to maybe be conquered, people surrendering possibly. And then we have the army again in the second register on the left coming in, and we see death. We see them killing the enemy. We see the enemy apparently retreating, or maybe prisoners of war. You'll notice they are nude. The army in question is fully clothed once again. And at the bottom, we have the chariots walking over the enemy's bodies. That imagery we saw from the Stele of the Vultures coming out once again. And when we look at it, we're generally reading from the bottom up and generally left to right. So we're getting, for example, from the point of people preparing for the banquet, to the point of people having offerings. We see things more prepared. We see bulls, sheep, probably offerings for the banquet. And then at the top level here, we see the banquet as a whole with some kind of ruler seated at the front. We have what are likely servants standing. And then the seated figures are all going to be important, probably diplomats in this case. We also see strong hierarchy of scale, so the larger figures are more important. The servants, for example, in this case, the man with the lyre and the man behind him, are smaller, clearly, than the figure that is seated. You'll also notice that the whole thing is put together basically like a mosaic. So the blue is lapis, a very, very valuable stone they would have gotten in trade from Afghanistan at the time. The white is likely to be ivory or bone, which has been used. So we have some valuable materials being worked with. In terms of detail, the details are etched into place. And some of these elements are things that have been added later on, mostly by people trying to restore the piece. So we find the wood base underneath it had rotted, and we have all of these different pieces. So anywhere that you see what looks like paste here and the black here, for example, that is all restoration. But the detail is really truly incredible when we look at the piece, all of that etching in, the wheels of the chariot, we get a sense of their construction and their movement, the horses and the detail there, even the dying enemy with the wounds cut into him and bleeding out. We do also get a sense of the society at the time, a very hierarchical society. And many societies are, because once you have a leader, we don't want too many leaders. We want a few people under them, but not too many. And so you get this hierarchy where you have slaves and farmers typically at the bottom and rulers and priests typically at the top. And here we see that through hierarchy of scale. We also see distortion, for example, in the enemy compared to the soldiers in the army. So here we have the army soldiers, and here we have the enemy. And you'll notice the enemy has really odd lines, long neck, oddly shaped bodies. The soldiers, however, all look nearly identical, giving that impression, even though subtly, of the message, which is that we were victorious, we won this great victory, and we had this banquet or celebration or whatever it happens to be, maybe cult ritual, that was a result of this grand victory. And again, this is visual history and propaganda. This is something that would be put out so that the people could see it and remember the great deeds of their rulers.